Many years ago, I was in a literature and film class that required us to both read Bram Stoker's iconic novel Dracula and watch Nosferatu, the 1922 silent film that ripped it off. After I'd done both, I looked into the history of the film and discovered that, upon Nosferatu's release, there had been an intense battle to have it completely wiped from the face of the earth. We won't be getting into the legalities of that little snafu here, but suffice to say that yes, Nosferatu is Dracula in all but name, and Stoker's estate hadn't been at all happy about it. Which is why I found it so interesting that this newest addition to the vampire genre had elected to adapt the 1922 film, rather than the source material from which it took heavy inspiration. After all, why not just go right to the book rather than the adaptation? After watching the Robert Eggers helmed film, however, I realized exactly why that decision had been made. While it follows the same basic beats as Stoker's masterpiece and adheres to the broad strokes of the 1922 film, Eggers' Nosferatu flexes its muscles in a way that simply couldn't be done if they dogmatically stuck to only the novel. Add to that the fact that Dracula has been adapted to death, and it makes sense that they wouldn't want to try reinventing the wheel with Nosferatu. All this is to say that the decision to remake the 1922 film was a very smart one, and serves the production well as it delves into the gothic horror that is Nosferatu. As always, I would highly recommend that you watch the movie before this video, so you'll have a frame of reference for what I'm talking about. I'd also like to add the caveat that you watch the original as well, before you go see the remake if at all possible. It's free on YouTube, so definitely go check it out. Lastly, here's your obligatory spoiler warning, so if you do want to go see the movie, definitely do that before you go any further. We're going to kick things off with my favorite part of any piece of media, be it a book, show, or film. The world that is created for the audience to step into. From the opening frame, we're shown a dour, grim, gothic depiction of 19th century Germany. The color palette is cold, the architecture is menacing, and the sky is perpetually gray. It's a world that sucks you in with little effort and holds you there as the story begins to unfold around you. As I watched, I couldn't help but feel like this is how it must have felt to see the original movie when it came onto the scene a century ago. Before we move on, I'd like to say that you can feel the reverence for the original that went into this production, particularly with the cinematography. It's not just callbacks like the strange way that Hutter cuts his bread or the iconic framing of Orlok's shadow on the wall. It's the camera work itself, with its long, static shots, perfectly framed I might add, and the slow panning to give the viewer a full understanding of a set. It's the hard close-ups of faces to allow the actors to emote, and the deliberate use of filters to convey any given time of day. It's all of these things taken together that establish the dark mood of this film and keep the tension ratcheted to 11 at all times. And that's what this movie is really all about, the mood, the uncanny feeling that comes about in the presence of evil, of the supernatural. As I made my notes for this movie, I kept writing words like creepy, atmosphere, desolate, and tension, underlining them so I wouldn't forget. This movie stretches itself to the breaking point to make sure that the viewer understands and feels the world it's creating. In fact, it left such an impression that I found myself getting annoyed that I had to take notes at all, because every time I did, I had to pull myself out of the world to take them. As you can imagine, a movie like Nosferatu lives and dies by its villain. Yes, there are other characters who play their roles well. Nicholas Hoult, who I knew was going places even as far back as Skins, the British teen drama, turns in an admirable performance as Thomas Hutter. Willem Dafoe can do no wrong as a general rule. Aaron Taylor-Johnson and Lily Rose Depp, despite being the weaker links in the chain, still pull their weight as Friedrich Harding and Ellen Hutter, respectively. But the standout, the key piece, the point on which this entire movie turns, as you can probably imagine, was Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok. Unrecognizable and utterly menacing, he is everything you'd want from a Dracula knockoff, and honestly, even more. From a visual standpoint, he is like nothing we've ever seen from a vampire before. Gone is the urbane, cultured, beautiful being that we've been conditioned to expect from the likes of Anne Rice and Stephanie Meyer. In this film, Orlok is the personification of the undead. He is emaciated and sickly. His body is in a constant loop of decay and rebirth, with sores and pustules open across his body. Blood does not regenerate him as we've seen in past films in the genre. It merely keeps him alive, and even then only just. His voice is deep and rattling, as if his lungs were caked with dust and phlegm. His movements are slow and measured, as if he knows that he has nothing to fear in this world. He is a black magician, a warlock, a soulless, unrepentant monster making deals with the devil for powers no mortal should have. In short, he's absolutely perfect. My one complaint with Count Orlok is that we're expected to believe that this centuries-old being, totally aware of his one vulnerability, completely forgot what time it was because he was too busy having sex. This was my main complaint with the ending of the original film as well, and although it's much more graphic this time around, my issue remains the same. But I suppose that's a nitpick when taken in the grand scheme of everything else that this movie does right. From a writing standpoint, Nosferatu brings a lot to the table, and in a way that, I have to admit, I wasn't expecting. While following the course laid out by the original, Robert Eggers, who both wrote and directed it, manages to add to the story and themes in a way that doesn't detract from the plot. One of the main themes he explores is the concept of modernity versus the old world. The 19th century was a time of great advancement in terms of humanity's understanding of the natural world. It was also a time where we debunked as superstition and fairy tale a vast quantity of that which had been considered fact. Nosferatu adroitly sets these two concepts against each other by having the characters refuse to accept the supernatural and stubbornly cling to what their science tells them, which ironically would have been the inverse a century prior. A comment could be made here on the subject of humanity's loss of spirit, soul, and faith in the face of technological advancement, but I'm not going to put words in Eggers' mouth just to add another minute to my runtime. Instead, I'd like to mention the unflinching nature with which Nosferatu tackles its subject matter. The easiest way to show this would be by comparing it to Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, and how needlessly horny that movie was. It's going to sound like I'm trashing it, but I promise you that I'm not. It's one of my all-time favorite guilty pleasure movies, and I'll still throw it on every now and then. Now, there's no small amount of nudity and sexual content in Nosferatu. It's unavoidable given its source material and the themes it brings to the fore. However, whereas Coppola's version reveled in it, often at the expense of everything else, Nosferatu shines a cold light on it, revealing the dark realities of what it really means to have a centuries-old undead monster drain your blood as he rapes you. It's uncomfortable to watch, and rightly so. Quite frankly, I feel like the romanticization of such concepts has done a disservice to the horror and fantasy genre in general, but that's a whole other video. Nosferatu takes the idea of sex for pleasure's sake and repurposes it as a base need to be exploited and fulfilled, regardless of all other considerations. An interesting take, to be sure. Next, I'd like to go into how this movie approaches horror as a genre. It's too often that we get a horror movie and it turns out to be little more than torture porn and jump scares. Hollywood seems to have forgotten that scared and startled are two completely different things. Robert Eggers has not. He masterfully builds a slow-burning tension, both by showing and not showing what it is that you're supposed to be afraid of. A perfect example of this is when Hutter arrives at Orlok's castle. For the entirety of this sequence, we never see Orlok fully. We get a silhouette from an extreme distance, or a close-up of his hands, or we hear his voice while the camera is on Hutter. We never get to put the whole puzzle together. This generates fear, more precisely fear of the unknown, which, if you know your Lovecraft, is the best kind of fear. Sure, there are a couple jump scares here and there in the movie, but on the whole, Eggers prefers to stretch that violin string until it's ready to snap, rather than desensitize his audience by snapping it over and over again. Finally, I want to talk about the issues I had with the writing. No movie is perfect, and Nosferatu is no exception, but my comments should be taken with the understanding that this is still a phenomenal movie that you should definitely go see in theaters. My main issues are with the quote-unquote choices that Orlok offers our heroes. Tricking Hutter into signing Ellen away really doesn't hang with the concept of supernatural contracts for me. I feel like if Orlok really needed to drive a wedge between them so he could go after Ellen, then tricking Thomas into signing it wouldn't really do the job. Next, we've got the choice he offers Ellen. Accept Orlok's advances and forget about Thomas, or Orlok kills everyone and everything she loves. What kind of choice is that? Yes, on paper it's an either-or decision, so it's technically a choice, but is it really? If Ellen refuses Orlok, then he just keeps ratcheting up the body count until she agrees. Her deepest fear, being alone, is what brought them together, and it's now being used to force her hand. A no-win scenario is convenient to keep a plot moving forward, but it can come off as lazy writing at times. As I said in the beginning, watching Robert Eggers' Nosferatu in theaters left me feeling how I imagine original audiences must have felt in 1922. It's the kind of horror film that I love. It's a slow burn of a movie that revels in its darkness and gothic overtones. It unflinchingly shows the realities of its world and of what a vampire could be, and it keeps its foot more or less on the gas until the credits roll. Again, this is a must-see in theaters, after watching the original to add an extra layer of film appreciation. I can guarantee you that you won't be disappointed that you did. Anyway, that's all I've got for you this time, so if you could do me a favor and hit the like and subscribe buttons, I'd really appreciate it. Every little bit helps me out. Also, go ahead and check out the other videos on my channel, or hit up my website to see my blog and maybe buy one of my books on Amazon. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.